We're going to get this party started with Chris Neal. Welcome to the virtual chapter. It is our live webinar format. We're a group of volunteers, parents, grandparents, friends, really anyone that knows someone who's struggling with addiction of any age. That's what we do here, dealing with substance use disorders. Our mission is really simple. We're caring parents offering hope through resources, education, and shared experiences. The virtual chapter is different from our live in-person meetings, and it's streamed here on Facebook and in a private Zoom webinar room. So if you want to protect your anonymity and you want to watch privately so that you can type in whatever name you want, do that through our Zoom room. The links for the Zoom webinar room can be found first on our website, parentshelpingparents.info. You can also find that link on our Facebook page at Parents Helping Parents, Inc. So take your pick, but we're glad you're joining us either way. We only have one rule. What's said here stays here. So feel free to share, feel free to ask questions. We don't point fingers, we don't judge, we only offer support. Many of us have had some of the same questions you've had, have had some of the same experiences you've had, and a few of us have been able to find answers. So we try to listen, we try to share our experiences and the things that we learned on our journey and the resources that we've uncovered along the way. We have no professional expertise. We've only walked in the shoes of a parent or a loved one. Our mission is limited to providing information, resources, and peer support. This meeting or any outreach of Parents Helping Parents offers should never be considered a substitute for professional counseling, legal advice, financial advice, medical services, all of which we think you should get if it's appropriate for your needs. In addition to that, we really love that you are here being a part of our virtual chapter. We love that we can do this for families and loved ones who are unable to attend a live chapter, but we really want to encourage you, if at all possible, connect with a local live chapter. There is no support better than a community of parents getting together in person and helping one another. So use this as a platform to launch into participation at one of our live chapters. For information about where those are and when they meet, check out our webpage, parentshelpingparents.info. During the course of tonight's meeting, feel free to comment and ask questions. You can do that on the live section of the Facebook feed, which we will be watching and monitoring. Remember that if you do that, that information is there forever. If you're watching from the Zoom room, you can ask questions publicly to everyone in the room, or you can ask questions privately just to me and to Chris. So whatever way your preference is, feel free to ask and comment as much as you'd like. If you want to be on our undisclosed email list, please comment your email in the Facebook thread or in the Zoom room. You'll only receive meeting notices and a quarterly newsletter. We don't spam anybody. We just want you to stay up to date on what's going on with Parents Helping Parents. If you would like to participate as a volunteer, help with meetings and speakers, get trained to answer our helpline, help spread the word about chapters or other opportunities, let us know in a comment or a chat that you want to volunteer. We can always use your help. So I'm really excited. We've got a good friend of mine and fellow therapist, Chris Neal, in the house to talk to you about resiliency. He will tell you more about his expertise and what he does here in Oklahoma City. So I will throw the video to him and we will get started. You're up. Oh, man.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Derek. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here. My name is Chris Neal. I am a therapist here in the Oklahoma City area, and I call myself an integrative psychotherapist. And that doesn't mean that I can't make up my mind about picking an approach. What it does mean is that I draw from a couple different approaches, and I believe that good therapy respects the fact that we've come from somewhere to lead us where we are. And so in my work, we often talk about family of origin. We talk about what's gone on in the past. I also think it's important that we be honest about where we're at and use that as a catapult to move forward. And so I find myself doing a lot of mindfulness work with people, which draws on cognitive behavioral work sometimes. I'm not really a cognitive behavioral therapist per se. I don't claim that, but I will claim some mindfulness in there. And so the people that I work with usually come to me when everything's on fire. Nobody ever calls me and says, "Hey, Chris, my life is going great. Can I start therapy?" And they call when things are pretty serious for them. But what I find is that once people get in and put out some of those brush fires and begin to uncover some of the earlier things that have gone on that led them to where they are, they find they want to unpack, they want to find out how to create a new life for themselves. And so that's pretty exciting. And it's just work that I get to do with people on a daily basis. And it's work that I'm incredibly thankful for. I'm also incredibly thankful for people like Derek who do work like this. And anytime I've needed support, I've been able to call Derek and say, hey, man, let's go have some coffee and, talk me off the ledge. And he comes in and we have great conversations. So it's great to have good colleagues. So Derek, thank you for that. I'm also a podcaster myself. I have a podcast called the Resilient Self Podcast. You can find it on all the podcast outlets, iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play and Spotify. In the last month or so, I've also taken the leap and added YouTube to the mix. And so you can also find it on YouTube. Search for the Resilient Self Podcast. You can also find all the episodes on my website, chrisneal.com, and Neal is spelled with an A and E-A-L. And I don't know if it's possible to have a link on there or something, Derek, but
I'm putting it on the Facebook feed right now.
Awesome, thank you. And so if you have questions for me, you want to visit about what I do, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. But I do encourage you to check out not only Derek's podcast, but also the Resilient Self podcast. We talk about a wide range of things, some of which we'll talk about tonight. So, it seems like in my practice, not because I put that energy out there specifically, I don't advertise to these people, I don't market myself to families who have alcoholism and addiction present in their families. But it seems like a lot of people with that in their families tend to find me. And it's really interesting because sometimes people will present for other issues. And then when we start talking, it turns out that they have that as well. And so I've always been keenly aware of issues that face people who have alcoholism in their family. And it's something that I will acknowledge to you. I have personal experience.
I think we're running now. Oh, going?
Check it.
Okay,
Are we good?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, I'm sorry. Actually, when I was on another live radio show several weeks ago, the video was messed, or the audio was messed up there too. So maybe I have the reverse Midas touch when it comes to that stuff. Yeah. So anyway, a lot of background working with families who face alcohol addiction, and it brings kind of its own challenges. And I don't have to describe those really to the people watching this broadcast, because I know you're deeply aware of the ways that can create challenges for everyone in the family unit. And so a couple of themes tend to crop up when I'm working with people. Again, when we deal with the past, but also deal with the present and where we want to go. And the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are resilience. And I'm never sure if it's resilience, resiliency. I'll use them both interchangeably. And then compassion, including self-compassion. And so we'll dive in on those things. Now, I was joking with Derek before the show here. My podcast is called the Resilient Self Podcast. And I'm about 20 episodes in on my podcast. And it occurred to me, I've never done an episode specifically on resilience. And so maybe that'll come forward here in a couple weeks. But I do spend a lot of time talking about mindfulness and compassion and lots of those related issues. So One of my favorite books on resilience is a book by Dr. Rick Hansen. And his kind of his initial claim to fame, I think, was a book called Buddha's Brain. And if you're psychologically minded at all, you might find that book really, really interesting. And in Buddha's Brain, he triangulates Eastern thought and psychology and neuroscience in some really interesting ways. And it sounds very academic. It's actually, he does that in a really accessible way. And so Dr. Hansen is terrific. And even though it's called Buddha's Brain, it's not really a book about trying to get you to be a Buddhist. And so if you have a different worldview, then I don't think he would offend you in any way. But his more recent book is a book called Resilient. And I was drawn to it just because I like his work. And so I read what Dr. Hansen has to say about resilience. And I'm going to kind of merge that with my own thoughts, it just sort of in defining resilience. What does that even mean? Because that's one of those terms we hear thrown around a lot. And we can think of it generally as how do we bounce back? But I think there's more to it than that. For me, I think there are two important parts to resilience. One is reclaiming the positive elements of the life we've had. So when we're faced with something like addiction, whether it's ourselves or someone else, that can really pull our lives apart. And we don't necessarily want to go back to the way it was, because that's how we got here in the first place. But we do want to pull some of the positive things, some of the family relationships and the other positive things from those. So part one of resilience is reclaiming the positive elements of what we've had. And part two is claiming the life that you want moving forward. And I think an important part of the healing process is pulling from positive psychology a little bit and just imagining, hey, what can my life be like as I move forward? And what am I dreaming of? What do I really want to have happen as I move forward? Because for most of us, just putting out the brush fires, putting out the things that are on fire isn't good enough, because that only gets us back to ground level. We want to think about doing more. And when we engage the therapy process, then it can motivate us, it can drive us and encourage us as well. Now, Hansen talks about 4 areas in resilience, and I think they're all pretty applicable. And some of these may be relevant, hopefully, for many of you. He has 4 R's: recognizing what is true, resourcing, what do we even have available to ourselves? And whenever I'm helping someone just kind of climb out of a hole, then we talk a lot about, what's going well in your life, or what could be going well in your life right now amidst the firestorm of everything else that's going on. And what we find is that even when things seem pretty low, often if we really sit down and look at it, we can find something. And particularly when we start to pull in mindfulness approaches and we begin to explore just the miracle of life itself, the fact that you're breathing often is a resource. And we have to be able to just be grateful for that sometimes. He talks about regulating our thoughts and our emotions. And how do we learn to do that? And then he talks about relating to others. And I think that's such a crucial element, is that relational aspect, because I find very few problems with people that I work with or in just other experiences I've had that don't have some kind of background or some serious effect on the relationships we have. And relationships have tremendous power to heal. And so I think it's important to invest in those just as deeply as we can. So resilience, I think, is probably the goal of recovery for most people. People want to move out of negative behaviors, out of these cycles of behavior, things like codependence, which I'll touch on here in just a minute. We want to move out of those things into patterns of positive, healthy, loving, caring behavior. That's kind of the goal. Now, when we're deep in addiction, when we're deep in those experiences, we can feel pretty low, and it can be really hard on the family unit. Again, I don't have to tell you. But there are 2 ways that we can approach the negative fallout that comes from addictive behavior. One is guilt. Guilt is what our world is, what our society is built on. Guilt is, I did a thing and the thing was bad. I shouldn't have done that. Or, the evil cousin to guilt, though, is shame. And shame is, I did a thing and I am bad. And I think that's a really important distinction. When we're talking about resilience, we have to understand that shame is the enemy of resilience. Shame is what tears us down. Shame is what allows us to take our mistakes, our errors, the ways that we acknowledge our own weakness, and we allow that to make us less. And when we can learn to step out of those negative cycles, both in our own minds and in shaming others, then we have hope for resilience at that point. And so getting rid of shame is I think, a crucial component in the healing process, not just in addiction, but in so many psychological arenas. If you don't know the work of Brene Brown, I want to recommend her work to you. She has just some terrific writing, and she's actually an even better speaker than she is a writer. And so check out her YouTube. She has some TED Talks that really went viral. And Brene Brown is a social worker, but she is a shame researcher. She has some terrific work, and she's really pretty inspirational and fun to listen to. Her books are terrific. I think she's a better speaker than she is a writer, but she's published millions of books, so there you go too. But that distinction between guilt and shame, I think, is an important thing to recognize. And when we're dealing with someone who's on a recovery path, if we're going to support them, I think we have to find ways to do that where we can acknowledge the ways they've harmed us. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We have to be able to acknowledge the hurt that lies in our relationships, but we have to do that in ways that don't tear people down, that don't make them less. We learn to have feelings and discussions about the actions rather than the quality of the person we're sitting across from. So how do we get rid of shame? For me, in my attitude, and I usually don't speak unequivocally. In fact, my clients usually get kind of bugged at me sometimes because I tell them I don't give advice. And they're like, Chris, just tell me what to do. And I won't do it. But to me, the absolute kryptonite to shame is compassion. And you hear that word also used a lot, and compassionate this, compassionate that. But I think compassion gets misused a lot. I want to point you to another book, The Compassionate Mind by Paul Gilbert. And even though the word Buddhism is not in the title, he's probably more overtly Buddhist in The Compassionate Mind than Rick Hanson is in Buddha's Brain. But even if you're not interested in that worldview, he has some terrific ideas on compassion and how we can integrate compassion into our lives, into the healing process. And so between Hanson's work and just some of the things I've gleaned from other places, I've come to define compassion in a very specific way. And it's something that my clients tend to find useful. Now, let me talk for a second, though, about what compassion is not. Because I had someone say to me, we were talking about self-compassion, and many years ago, I had someone say to me, Chris, if I have self-compassion, doesn't that make me a slacker? And I had to think about it. I thought, that's a great question. And I really had to think about my answer. And ultimately, the answer is no. Self-compassion does not make you a slacker. But we have to understand that compassion, whether it's for the self or someone else, is not about saying, oh, it's okay. You don't have to live up to behavior standards that we have in our society or in our relationship. You can keep hurting me, and that's okay. That's not compassion. Okay, if you're an alcoholic, you can keep drinking. That's not compassion. That's enabling. And when we make excuses for other people's behavior or make excuses for our own behavior, that is not compassion or self-compassion. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And I've been asked for compassion from people before in times when what they really wanted was not compassion. They wanted enabling. And so that can be a struggle. When you're in the orbit of an addict, it can really be hard. And that's where we have to start with compassion for the self. And we'll get into that here in just a minute. But here's my definition of compassion. Radical honesty, followed by holding space for the other person to respond as they need to your radical honesty. Okay? And then mixed in with all of that is loving kindness. So we're pulling from mindfulness a little bit there. So radical honesty with loving kindness and holding space with loving kindness. And when we can do that, then we can be entirely authentic with someone. We can say to someone, the way that you're behaving crosses a boundary for me, and I love you, but your behavior crosses a boundary, and I'm not okay with that. So let's talk about what we're going to do with this. And that's a really hard conversation to have with someone you love. It's a really hard conversation to have with your child, your father, your mother, and I acknowledge that. And I think compassion for the self would involve being able to say to yourself, this is a hard conversation. This is difficult for me. And we'll talk about that more here in just a minute. But when we can be radically honest with someone and just be completely straightforward with loving kindness. Now, it's not an excuse to be a jerk to someone. It's not an excuse to use that radical honesty to punish them for the ways they've harmed you. Radical honesty with loving kindness is setting boundaries. It's telling someone, this is where my line is. This is what I'm willing to do. This is what I'm willing to accept in my life. This is where I end and you begin. And that's really where codependence and compassion cannot coexist. Let's see, did I write myself a note about this? Because I want to make sure I talk about, Derek, have you had someone talk about codependence much?
It's come up a few times, but you talk about whatever you want, Chris.
Okay, thanks. So codependency, however you want to call it, is the term was coined, I think, in the early 70s, coming out of the addiction treatment community. I think it was in Minneapolis. If you haven't read Melody Beattie's book, Codependent No More, it's a terrific book. It is a numbing slap in the face sometimes when you give that book. And it's interesting, what I found is a lot of times when I give that book to someone, it can take them a good 6 or 8 weeks before they'll actually pick it up and read it. And so, hey, go ahead and order it, set it on the shelf, and then come back to it in a month or two, and it'll be waiting for you, okay? But codependency, depending on how you define it, is either the need to be needed, or as I tend to lean more towards, and I say to people, codependency is kind of like barbecue. It means something different to every person. So to me, barbecue is beef with a tangy sauce. To Derek, it might mean pork with a sweet sauce. I don't know. Same thing with codependency. It has a different definition for however it's meaningful to you. To me, codependency is pulling your own emotional well-being, and I have to put that in air quotes, from what you get from other people. So with my clients, I talk about emotional tofu. Tofu takes on the flavor of whatever you're cooking it in. And I think of codependence in that way, that when we have codependent behaviors, codependent attitudes in our relationship, we pull our attitudes from the acceptance that we get from other people. And so you can probably imagine then, when there's an addict in the family, everything kind of rotates around that person, that person's drama, that person's needs. We all sort of rotate around that, and we learn to accommodate that in many ways. And if it's a parent, then, growing up, the parent is the ultimate authority in the family. And so you can spend the first 20, 30, 40, 50 years of your life thinking that that's just how it goes and that's normal. And then one day you wake up and go, oh, it's not, and I want to do something different. And I'm not going to go down the codependency rabbit hole too far, but if that's a term that's meaningful for you, then there are lots of resources out there. But there's a deep connection in my mind between shame and codependence, because codependence is really putting your own self-worth in the hands of someone else. And it's almost like saying, I'm not worthy of deciding this for myself. Now, every case is unique, of course, but I think there's a lot of overlap there. So shame equals darkness, it equals codependency, it equals enabling. And in a family with addiction, we get all of those things until we learn to put them in check. And putting them in check is so hard, and I know that. Compassion, however, is light. Compassion is authenticity, and compassion is empowering everyone with truth. And so when we can develop compassion for others, compassion for an addict is not saying it's okay, you get to use these behaviors, do these behaviors. Compassion is saying, this is how you get to continue to be in my space. And then holding space for that person to respond as they're going to. All of this requires the ability to have non-judgmental observation, to be able to make observations about things, behaviors, people, without making it about the person. And that's a skill. It's something we can get better at. There's a lot of reading out there. There are some therapists out there, including myself, who like to work on those things with people. So there's compassion, kind of in a nutshell. And I'm sure you're figuring out very quickly that shame, resiliency, compassion, radical honesty, holding space, loving kindness, those things all sort of are kind of in a big bubble together. And we kind of pick and choose as we need to in the moment. Now, what about self-compassion? The same thing applies. Radical honesty with yourself, holding space for yourself, loving kindness, all together. When I'm doing self-compassion work, my first question is always, what is my truth in this moment? And because it's so easy in any circumstances of life to get focused either on what's been in the past or what might happen in the future. Most of the brain's activity is inhibitory. It's shutting things out. Most anxiety is what we call anticipatory anxiety. We're not worrying about things that are happening right now. We're worried about things that might happen in the future. And when we can kind of put down that shovel, shut down that anticipatory anxiety, then we can deal with what's actually true for us right now. I talk about true being accurate, verifiable, and now. When we can have those three qualities to a message in our mind, we have a chance of it being true. When we're predicting the future is never true, even if you accidentally get lucky, because predicting the future may be accurate. It's not verifiable yet because it hasn't happened yet, and it's not now. It's not in the here and now. And so the more we can learn to focus our energies on what's true in the here and now, then we enable ourselves in good ways to have self-compassion. We can be radically honest with ourselves about what's going on in me. Where's the tension in my body? Where's the tension in my psyche? Where's the hurt in my heart, mind, and body? And then when we're honest about that, we talk about that with ourselves, we acknowledge that. Then all of a sudden, we engage in this process where we can choose not to demand an alternate reality for ourselves. And when we learn to avoid demanding that reality be different than it is, that's a form of self-acceptance, right? And that's true self-compassion, is saying, you know what, I'm hurting and that's okay. I get to hurt. It gets to be hard. And when we can get to that point and not awfulize that, I think that's a game changer. And I think it's got to start with the self before you can do that with the other person. And so anytime, I talk about this so many times in my podcast, whenever we have troubles with other people, we've got to flip that inward. We've got to deal with our own stuff first. And then when we learn to deal with our own stuff so that it's okay for things to not be okay, then we can flip around and we can say, okay, I'm not okay with this. Let's talk about that. And then when we talk about it not being okay, then it's about the actions. It's about the behaviors. It's not about the person and the quality of that person. And so that's kind of where I'm at on that, guys, is resiliency and compassion are about loving your imperfect self so that you can love an imperfect other with a capital O. And when we can do that, I think there's hope. So that's what I've got for you today. That's a lot of information.
I actually made a comment on here and I said, I hope people are taking notes because there's all kinds of good stuff flying out. So we're going to open it up to live Q&A.
Great.
If anybody has any questions for Chris about anything that came up, now's the time to ask that. What's the name of your podcast?
The Resilient Self Podcast.
And one more time, how can people find it?
People can find me on YouTube at The Resilient Self. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, The Resilient Self Podcast. And you can go straight to YouTube. Or you can go to my website, chrisneal.com. And
we linked your website in the comments. So Jamie, if you click on his website up higher in the comments, you'll be able to get to more of his information.
And if you're curious, I do have on there, people can actually just sign up for my email list. I don't spam you or anything, but you can actually get a free 5-minute guided meditation that is really great, sort of as an introduction to some of this practice. It just walks you through becoming aware of the breath and just, being quiet in the moment and kind of learning to listen to your own body a little bit, which is kind of where we start on all this.
Somebody Chris earlier just commented that it was when you were talking about shame, that shame really keeps us silent and keeps us quiet. How does it do that? Like, how do you think shame plays a role in silencing us?
Shame, the core of shame is minimizing of ourselves. And so when we think we're not worthy, we're not deserving, it's easy to forget that everybody has a mask on. And so we see other people living these lives, and we just think we don't measure up, and it's embarrassing, and we just feel like we're not as good as other people. And there's all kinds of fallout that can come from that. And so, yeah, I think it does. It keeps us quiet because we think nobody would understand. We think nobody could understand. And then I think the key is finding someone that doesn't need to understand. They just need to love you and hold space for you. I think that's the key.
One of the other things you said that I actually made a note of was when you were talking about pulling your resources in and how important that is. You touched on it, but talk a little bit more about the importance of gratitude itself as a resource, because I thought that was really good.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you said that because I forgot to mention that. Gratitude is one of those things, it's funny, when I start doing mindfulness work with people, sometimes, they think, oh, I've heard all about this. This is great. I'm going to learn how to do mindfulness. And then I say, okay, so close your eyes and pay attention to your breath. And they do that. And then they say, okay, now what? I'm like, keep paying attention to your breath. And after a minute or two, they're like, is that it? I'm like, well, it's an important start. And gratitude is kind of like that in a way. The benefits, I think, are deceptive in so many ways. There's a real neuroscience to gratitude. The brain has a negative bias. And so, I know folks are fond of saying, oh, we're wired for happiness, we have to do that. I don't think that's true. I think we are wired to be suspicious and tribal and aggressive as a people. Now we're trying to grow out of that, but the human brain hasn't changed much in 40,000 years or more. And a gratitude, if you think of it this way, if the brain is 6 or 7 times more wired towards negativity, then it takes one positive thought to balance, it takes 6 or 7 positive thoughts to balance one negative thought. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm a great storyteller. I can get 100 negative thoughts in just the blink of an eye. I'm so good at that. And so if we're going to balance that out, that's 600 or 700 positive thoughts we have just to come back to ground level. And I haven't heard it put this way, but my interpretation is also when there's neutral stimuli, I think we're probably 6 or 7 times more likely to view that negatively than positively. And so gratitude it's not turn your frown upside down. I don't believe in that. I don't think it works that way. I don't think you can just say, okay, I won't be anxious. Okay, I won't be sad. It doesn't work like that. But what I think it does work like is when we learn to engage gratitude, we literally are rewiring the brain and we're balancing those scales. And when I do gratitude work with people, usually my assignment involves, okay, 3 points of gratitude a day, but 2 of them have to be almost insignificant. And to me, the power in that is, sure, we can all be grateful that, we're not at war in the moment. We don't have nuclear war or, whatever. We can be grateful for the big things. But I think, Derek, learning to be grateful for the smell of the air in the morning, or the taste of your coffee, or, the sound of your partner's voice when you talk to them on the phone. Those tiny little things, I think when we learn to recognize those and acknowledge them, I think it balances the scales. It kind of rewires us a little bit in important ways. I don't know if that's where you're going with that, but that's...
No, that's great. I just thought that was so important. I just
Yeah.
wanted some more.
No, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, that actually came up in a session today with one of my clients. So that's good stuff.
It's more powerful than people think it is. You know, you start doing that and you can feel kind of dumb writing down, I like the way my coffee smelled this morning. But
well, what I had noticed today with the person that I was talking to is that when things have been so dark or gloomy in your life for so long, that we have a hard time celebrating any progress because we're stuck in that mentality that we're so far from healthy.
Yes.
And that keeps us stuck. We've got to be grateful for little progress because that's change. And the fact that we're not celebrating it is making it worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Still got time for a couple of questions. If anybody has questions, shoot those over to us on Facebook or in the Zoom chat. Chris, what do you think is hard? You made the comment about the importance of holding the space for someone or in families. Why is that so challenging for us as people?
Well, when it's someone we love, especially when we get wrapped up in that codependent cycle, we want to fix. You know, if you catch yourself saying, I'm a fixer, you might want to do some reading about codependency because those really go together. It's someone you care about. You know, you've got a lot at stake in that person. It's your son, it's your daughter, it's your father, it's your aunt, it's whoever. You want this person to be healthy and you want the drama to just kind of stop so you can get on about the business of living. But I think part of it is when those things happen, you know, I think it touches on a lot of our own insecurities too. You know, I think it's hard. You know, I know that when I was dealing with my dad over the years, one of the things that would go through my mind is, wow, is this my history? Is this, you know, is this my future? Is this what it's going to look like for me in 30 years? And so it can be scary when it's, you know, and I think as a parent, I think it's natural as a parent to blame yourself when your kids go astray. And I don't think that even has to be substance abuse. I think anytime your kids go astray, I think it's a natural reaction for parents to blame themselves. It feels like a lot of other people are lining up to blame you. So yeah, I think holding space is hard because there's so much more in that conversation. It's not a simple equation.
Yeah.
You know?
All right, we're going to give it one final awkward pause to make sure nobody's got any questions, and then we'll wrap up for the night. I need some Jeopardy music.
Yeah, right.
To queue up right now. All right, you're officially off camera.
All right.
Chris.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us again. Chris, thanks for being here. Some fantastic information. So if you watch this video post live, like it and share it because people need to hear that information about how to foster self-resiliency and some of the differences, especially between compassion and enabling. Lots of great information there. So thank you, everybody, for joining us again. You can get in touch with Chris at his website, chrisneal.com. It is linked in our Facebook comments. The number one thing you can do to support Parents Helping Parents is like our page, share our page, like our content, share our content so that our goal in reaching parents of hurting people can be achieved. Because the more people that are pushing our content out, the more people that need to hear the information are going to get it. So thanks for joining us. Come back Monday, October the 7th at the same time, 7 o'clock. To hear my good friend Patty Mason bring us some more quality information. Thank you guys. Enjoy your week.